Sometimes the things we think are worthless hold the greatest treasures of all. For a man who'd spent his whole life wondering about the father who abandoned him, $1 would unlock secrets buried for decades. Elias McCrae bought a broken wagon from the livery stable in town. Everyone laughed at the old mountain man for wasting his money. The wagon was falling apart, covered in rust, and looked ready for the scrap heap. But when Elias got it home and forced open the back door, he found something incredible. Inside were maps, journals, and treasure from a missing surveyor crew, men who had vanished 30 years ago while searching for gold. The real surprise came when Elias found a letter written to a daughter back east. He recognized the handwriting immediately. How could this forgotten wagon connect him to the father he never knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Hammond's livery as Elias McCrae counted out 4 quarters into the stable owner's calloused palm. Behind them, the object of their transaction sat like a forgotten monument to better days, a freight wagon that had seen more storms than most men see winters. "You sure about this, Elias?" Jake Harmon asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "That old thing's been sitting here since before my boy was born, and he's near 20 now. Wheels are cracked, the canvas is more holes than fabric, and I swear something's died under the floorboards." Elias ran his fingers along the wagon's iron-reinforced side rails, feeling the rough texture of rust and weather damage. The metal was cold, despite the warming day, and something about that coolness felt familiar, like touching a memory he couldn't quite place. Sometimes the things that look most broken are just waiting for the right person to see their worth. The small crowd that had gathered to witness what they considered Elias's latest eccentricity exchanged knowing glances. Martha Henderson from the general store shook her head with the practiced disapproval of a woman who'd seen too many foolish purchases in her time. "Elias McCrae, you've got more sense in your little finger than most folks have in their whole head. But this here's just throwing good money after bad." "Maybe so," Elias replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts over popular opinion. "But every gamble's got 2 sides to it. Young Timothy Mills, barely old enough to shave, but full of the wisdom that youth mistakes for experience, laughed outright. "Mr. McCrae, my pa says that wagon's been cursed since the day it rolled into town. Says the last folks who owned it just up and vanished one day. Left it behind like they was running from something terrible." Elias paused in his examination of the wagon's undercarriage, where thick layers of mud and debris had hardened into something resembling concrete. "Your pa's got a good imagination, son. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the truest one. Folks move on, and they don't always take everything with them." But even as he spoke those words, Elias felt a peculiar stirring in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times during his 30 years in the mountains, when his instincts warned him of hidden dangers or unexpected opportunities. This wagon wasn't just abandoned property. It was waiting for something, or someone. The crowd began to disperse as the novelty wore off, but Martha lingered, her sharp eyes studying Elias with the intensity of someone who'd known him since he was barely taller than a fence post. "Elias, you've been acting strange lately. Ever since you came down from your winter camp, you've had a look about you, like a man searching for something he can't name." She wasn't wrong. The past few months had brought an restlessness that Elias couldn't shake, a feeling that his solitary life in the mountains was missing some essential piece. At 62, he'd lived more than most men could claim. Survived harsh winters, tracked dangerous game, carved out a living from land that most folks considered uninhabitable. But lately, in the quiet hours before dawn, he found himself wondering about the roads not taken, the questions never asked. "Maybe I'm searching, Martha. Maybe we all are, in our own ways." Jake Harmon spat into the dust and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Well, whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it in that pile of rotted wood and rusted iron. You want me to help you load her onto your rig?" "I'd appreciate that kindly. The process of loading the decrepit wagon onto Elias's own sturdy freight hauler took the better part of an hour. The thing was heavier than it appeared, as if the years of neglect had somehow added weight rather than subtracting it. More than once, Jake muttered under his breath about the foolishness of the endeavor, but Elias noticed that the older man handled the wagon with a certain reverence, as if he too sensed something significant about their transaction. As they secured the last of the rope bindings, Jake straightened and fixed Elias with a look that carried decades of frontier wisdom. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about that wagon. Said it belonged to a survey crew that came through here back in the 50s, maybe early 60s. They was mapping the territory for the railroad, but they got caught up in some kind of gold fever. One day they was here, next day they was gone, left behind this wagon and a pile of debts at the hotel. What happened to them? Nobody knows for certain. Some folks say they struck it rich and headed for California. Others reckon they got themselves killed by claim jumpers or hostile tribes. My grandfather always maintained they just got swallowed up by the mountains, like the land itself decided to keep 'em." Elias absorbed this information while checking the security of their knots one final time. Every frontier town had its collection of mysterious disappearances and unexplained events. Men and women who arrived with grand plans and vanished without explanation, leaving behind only fragments of their stories. Most of these tales grew taller with each telling until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. "Interesting story," he said finally. "But stories and truth don't always share the same road." The journey back to Elias's mountain cabin took 3 hours of careful driving over rough terrain that tested both his skill and his equipment. The added weight of the wagon made every hill a challenge and every descent a lesson in patience. But as the familiar peaks came into view and the scent of pine and mountain air filled his lungs, Elias felt a growing sense of anticipation that he hadn't experienced in years. His cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering evergreens, a structure he'd built with his own hands using timber from the surrounding forest. It was simple but solid, designed for function rather than appearance, with a stone chimney that sent a thin column of smoke into the crisp mountain air. Behind the cabin, a small barn housed his horses and equipment, while a well-tended garden provided vegetables to supplement his diet of game and preserved foods. This was the life he'd chosen after leaving. Civilization behind, a life of self-reliance and solitude that had served him well for 3 decades. But as he unhitched the horses and led them to the barn, Elias found himself looking at his familiar surroundings with fresh eyes, as if the wagon's presence had somehow altered the landscape itself. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Elias finally turned his full attention to his purchase. In the clear mountain light, the wagon's condition seemed even worse than it had appeared in town. The canvas covering was sun-bleached and torn, hanging in tatters that fluttered like prayer flags in the evening breeze. The wooden sides bore the scars of countless journeys, gouges from rocks, burns from campfires, and the inevitable wear that comes from constant exposure to the elements. But it was the iron fittings that captured Elias's attention, thick bands of metal that had been forged with obvious skill and care. Despite the rust and corrosion, these pieces showed signs of exceptional craftsmanship, the kind of work that spoke of builders who took pride in their creation. Someone had invested significant time and money in this wagon, which made its abandonment all the more puzzling. The rear of the wagon was secured by a heavy iron latch that had rusted into position, resisting Elias's initial attempts to open it. He retrieved his tools from the barn and spent the remaining daylight hours working to free the mechanism, applying penetrating oil and careful pressure to coax the stubborn metal back to life. As darkness fell and the mountain air grew cold, Elias lit a lantern and continued his work by its flickering light. There was something almost ceremonial about the process, as if he were conducting an archaeological excavation rather than simply opening an old wagon. With each turn of his wrench and each application of leverage, he felt closer to uncovering whatever secrets lay hidden within. Finally, near midnight, The latch gave way, with a groan of protesting metal that echoed across the silent clearing. Elias paused for a moment, his hand on the wagon's rear gate, feeling the weight of anticipation settle around him like the mountain darkness itself. Whatever lay inside this wagon had been waiting for 30 years to see daylight again. As he prepared to lift the gate and peer into the interior, Elias McCrae had no way of knowing that he was about to discover not just the remnants of a vanished survey crew, but the missing pieces of his own family's history. The lantern's yellow glow cast dancing shadows as Elias lifted the wagon's rear gate, its hinges protesting with a sound like wounded animals. The smell that emerged was complex. Old leather, musty fabric, and something else, something metallic and earthy that spoke of long-buried secrets. He held the lantern high and peered into the darkness within. What he saw defied his expectations entirely. Instead of the empty space or collection of worthless debris he'd anticipated, the wagon's interior was packed with carefully arranged items, each wrapped in oilcloth and canvas, as if someone had taken great care to preserve them against the ravages of time. Wooden crates were stacked with military precision, their surfaces bearing the stenciled marks of surveying companies and government agencies that Elias didn't recognize. His hands trembling slightly with excitement, Elias reached for the nearest bundle. The oilcloth crackled as he unwrapped it, revealing a leather-bound journal whose pages had been protected so well that they appeared almost new. The cover bore an embossed seal he couldn't identify, and the initials TM in faded gold lettering. Opening the journal to its first page, Elias found himself reading the careful handwriting of someone who had obviously received formal education. The entries were dated beginning in the spring of 1859 and described the daily activities of what appeared to be a geological survey expedition. March 15th, 1859. Arrived in territory after 3 weeks' hard travel from Denver. The land here shows promising mineral formations, particularly in the higher elevations where ancient water action has exposed bedrock. The morale remains high despite challenging conditions. As Elias read further, the journal revealed the story of 5 men who had been commissioned by a mining consortium to map potential ore deposits in the region. They were educated men, scientists and engineers, rather than simple prospectors, equipped with sophisticated instruments and detailed knowledge of geological formations. But as the entries progressed through spring and into summer, a change became apparent in the writer's tone. What had begun as clinical observations gradually became more personal, more urgent. The team had discovered something significant, something that transformed their routine mapping expedition into something else entirely. June 8th, 1859. Williams believes we have found it, the mother lode that every prospector dreams of. The vein extends deep into the mountain, further than our equipment can measure. If his calculations are correct, this single discovery could yield more gold than the California fields produced in their best years. Elias felt his pulse quicken as he read these words by lantern light. The mountain silence broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the pines. These men had found gold, real gold, in quantities that could change lives and alter the course of history. Yet they had vanished, leaving behind their wagon and their secrets. He reached for another bundle, this one containing detailed maps drawn on heavy paper that had survived the decades remarkably well. The cartography was precise and professional, showing elevations, water sources, and geological features with the kind of accuracy that spoke of serious scientific training. But overlaid on these topographical details were additional markings in red ink, symbols, numbers, and notations that appeared to mark specific locations. One map in particular caught his attention, a detailed rendering of the mountain valley where his own cabin sat. The familiar landmarks were all there. The creek that ran behind his property, the distinctive rock formation that served as his guide when hunting, even the meadow where he gathered wild herbs each spring. But according to this map, his land sat directly above what the surveyors had marked as primary vein, estimated depth 200 feet. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These men hadn't simply found gold somewhere in the territory. They had found it on what was now his property, land he had purchased and lived on for 30 years without ever suspecting what lay beneath his feet. With growing urgency, Elias reached deeper into the wagon, unwrapping bundle after bundle of materials. There were more journals, scientific instruments wrapped in felt, and small wooden boxes containing rock samples labeled with dates and locations. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming both thrilling and deeply disturbing. Near the back of the wagon, his fingers encountered something different. A small iron strongbox that had been carefully wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth. The weight of it surprised him. Whatever was inside was both dense and valuable enough to merit such protection. The box bore a simple lock, but the key was nowhere to be found among the other materials. Elias carried the strongbox back to his cabin, where he worked carefully with his tools to open it without damaging whatever lay within. When the lock finally yielded and he lifted the heavy lid, his breath caught in his throat. Gold nuggets, dozens of them, each wrapped individually in soft cloth and arranged with obvious care. They ranged in size from pieces no larger than pebbles to chunks that filled the palm of his hand, their surfaces gleaming in the lamplight with the unmistakable luster of pure metal. Accompanying the gold was a small leather pouch filled with what appeared to be uncut gemstones, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires that caught and reflected the light like captured stars. But it was the document folder at the bottom of the strongbox that truly changed everything. Inside, Elias found official papers, claim certificates, survey reports, and correspondence with mining companies back east. The names on these documents were mostly unfamiliar, but one kept appearing throughout the paperwork with increasing frequency: Thomas McCrae. Elias stared at the name, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. McCrae was his family name, inherited from a father he had never known, a man who had disappeared from his life before Elias could form lasting memories. His mother had rarely spoken of his father, and when she did, it was only to say that he had been a dreamer who chased opportunities that never materialized. With shaking hands, Elias reached for the final item in the strongbox, a sealed envelope that bore the address of someone in Philadelphia and the notation, "For Sarah McCrae, personal and confidential." The envelope had never been opened, its wax seal still intact after more than 30 years. Inside the envelope was a letter written in the same careful handwriting as the journals, but this time the words carried the weight of personal emotion rather than scientific observation. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this letter, then the worst of my fears have come to pass, and I will not be returning to you and our son as I promised. I pray that whoever finds this will have the decency to ensure it reaches you, so that you might understand why I stayed away so long, and why I may never come home." The letter went on to explain Thomas McCrae's involvement with the survey expedition, his discovery of gold on what he believed to be unclaimed land, and his growing realization that powerful interests were working against his team. He had stayed behind when the others fled, hoping to secure the claims and return home with enough wealth to provide for his family's future. But he had underestimated the danger they all faced. "I have hidden the evidence of our discovery," the letter continued, "in hopes that someday it might benefit our family. Even if I cannot be there to provide for you myself, tell our son that his father loved him more than gold or glory, and that every day I spent away from home was spent working toward a future that might give him opportunities I never had." Elias lowered the letter, with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the profound realization of what he had discovered. The father he had never known, the man whose absence had shaped his entire life, had died trying to build a legacy for the son he left behind. And that legacy, gold, claims, and land rights, had been waiting in an abandoned wagon for 3 decades. waiting for the moment when the son would finally claim his inheritance. But as the full magnitude of his discovery settled over him, Elias began to understand that finding his father's treasure was only the beginning of his story. If Thomas McCrae and his team had been driven away or killed by those who wanted their claims, then the same forces might still be at work, still watching for anyone who might uncover the secret of the lost survey crew. The mountain wind whispered through the pines outside his cabin, but to Elias it now sounded like a warning rather than a lullaby. His quiet life of solitude was about to become something far more complicated and dangerous than he had ever imagined. Sleep eluded Elias that night as thoroughly as answers had eluded him for 30 years. He sat at his kitchen table until dawn. The letter from his father spread before him alongside the maps and journals, trying to piece together a story that had begun before his birth and somehow led to this moment. The gold nuggets gleamed in the lamplight like promises of a future he'd never dared imagine. But it was the words in his father's handwriting that held his attention. When the first grey light of morning crept through his windows, Elias made coffee and began a systematic examination of every document the wagon had yielded. The surveying reports painted a picture of a land rich beyond imagination, not just gold, but silver, copper, and rare minerals that mining companies back east would have killed for. His property, which he'd purchased for its isolation and hunting opportunities, sat at the heart of what the reports called the most significant mineral discovery in territorial history. The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through his window, Elias saw Martha Henderson riding up the trail to his cabin, her expression carrying the determined look of a woman who intended to get answers. He quickly gathered the most sensitive documents and locked them in his bedroom trunk before stepping onto his front porch to greet her. "Mornin', Martha. You're out early today." She dismounted with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been riding mountain trails since childhood, tying her horse to the hitching post with sharp, economical movements. "Don't you mournin' me, Elias McCrae. Half the town's buzzing about what you might have found in that wagon, and the other half thinks you've lost your mind entirely. I figured I'd ride up here and see for myself which half has it right." Martha had been part of his life since they were children, one of the few people who remembered him before he'd retreated to the mountains. She'd married young, been widowed early, and had spent the past 20 years running the general store with a combination of business sense and frontier toughness that earned respect throughout the territory. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was her. "Come in and have some coffee," Elias said. "But what I've got to tell you might be harder to believe than the stories folks are already spreading." Inside the cabin, Martha's sharp eyes immediately noticed the changes. Maps spread across his table, unfamiliar books stacked on his counter, and an overall sense that something significant had disrupted his normally orderly existence. She accepted the coffee he offered, but remained standing, her arms crossed in a posture that suggested she was prepared for whatever strange tale he might spin. "Show me," she said simply. Elias brought out one of the less sensitive maps, spreading it across the table where she could see the detailed topographical work and the mysterious red markings that indicated mineral deposits. He watched her face as she processed what she was seeing, noting the moment when her skepticism began to give way to something else. "This is surveyor's work," she said, running her finger along the precisely drawn elevation lines. "Professional work, the kind that costs serious money to commission." "Where did this come from?" The wagon was full of materials from a survey crew that disappeared in 1859. They were mapping mineral deposits for eastern mining interests, and according to their findings, they struck the biggest discovery in territorial history. Martha studied the map more closely, her merchant's mind quickly grasping the implications. "You're telling me that wagon was sitting in Jake Harmon's livery for 30 years, and nobody ever thought to look inside?" "Seems that way. Though from what I've read in their journals, there might be good reasons why folks avoided it. The survey team didn't just disappear, they were driven away or worse by people who wanted their claims. and you think those same people might still be around? It was the question Elias had been wrestling with since he'd finished reading his father's letter. 30 years was a long time, long enough for most of the original players to have died or moved on. But mining claims and mineral rights had a way of passing from hand to hand, generation to generation, especially when they represented the kind of wealth these documents suggested. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." Martha set down her coffee cup and fixed him with a look that carried decades of frontier wisdom. "Elias, I've known you since we were both knee-high to grasshoppers, and I've never seen you make a foolish decision. But what you're talking about here, this could get you killed. If there's really that much gold on your land, and if powerful people have been protecting claims to it all these years, they're not going to take kindly to you stirring things up. Maybe not. But I can't just pretend I never found this. That survey team, one of the men was my father." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Martha's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, something that acknowledged the weight of family obligation and the debts that the dead leave for the living to settle. "Your father," she repeated quietly. "The one who disappeared when you were small?" "Thomas McCrae. He was part of the survey crew, and according to his letter, he stayed behind when the others fled, trying to protect the claims for his family. For me and my mother, he never made it home." Martha absorbed this information in silence, her practical mind working through the implications. Finally, she spoke with the careful deliberation of someone choosing her words with great care. "What are you planning to do?" "First, I need to understand what I'm dealing with. The documents mention other claims, other survey marks. If my father's team really did find what these reports suggest, there should be physical evidence still out there. Claim markers, excavation sites, maybe even equipment they left behind. And if you find it, then I'll know for certain what I've inherited and what I might be up against." Martha stood and walked to the window, looking out at the familiar mountain landscape with new eyes. "This land has always felt peaceful to me," she said. "Hard to imagine it hiding secrets like this. Every piece of land has secrets, Martha. Most of them just stay buried." She turned back to him, her expression carrying the weight of decision. "You're going to need help with this, Elias. Whatever you're walking into, you can't face it alone. I appreciate the offer, but I won't put you in danger. That's not your choice to make. Besides, you'll need someone who understands business and law, someone who can help you navigate the legal side of whatever claims you might have. And you'll need someone you can trust absolutely." Looking at Martha's determined expression, Elias felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. For 30 years, he'd lived a life of self-reliance, depending on no one and responsible for no one but himself. But the discovery in the wagon had changed everything, connecting him not just to his father's memory, but to a world of complications he was only beginning to understand. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this careful and quiet. If there are people still watching for signs of this discovery, we don't want to give them any reason to pay attention to us." Martha smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn since arriving at his cabin. "Elias McCrae, you just bought yourself a partner in the most dangerous treasure hunt this territory has ever seen." 3 days later, Elias and Martha set out at dawn to search for the physical evidence that would confirm what the documents promised. They rode north along the creek that bordered Elias's property, following coordinates marked in his father's surveying notes. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and golden leaves drifted down from the aspen groves like nature's own treasure falling from the sky. Martha had proven surprisingly adept at reading the technical notations in the survey reports, her years of managing inventory and calculating profits translating well to interpreting measurements and coordinates. She rode beside Elias with a leather satchel containing copies of the most important maps, consulting them periodically as they navigated the familiar terrain that now held entirely new significance. "According to your father's notes," she said, reining in her horse beside a distinctive boulder formation, "there should be a claim marker somewhere within 50 yards of this spot." They dismounted and began a careful search of the area, looking for anything that might have been left by the survey crew 30 years earlier. The forest had reclaimed much of what humans had touched, but after 20 minutes of methodical searching, Elias found what they were looking for. Hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and overgrowth was a wooden stake driven deep into the ground, its top carved with symbols that matched those in the survey documents. The wood had weathered to a silver-grey color, but the carved markings were still clearly visible. Claim 7 TM and Associates. Filed June 1859. Thomas McCrae, Martha breathed, running her fingers over the carved initials. Your father really was here. The discovery of the claim marker transformed their search from hopeful speculation into urgent investigation. Over the next several hours, they located 3 more markers, each positioned according to the precise coordinates recorded in the survey notes. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic exploration and careful documentation, the work of men who understood both the science of geology and the legalities of mining claims. At the 4th marker, they made an even more significant discovery. Partially concealed by a fallen log was a canvas-wrapped bundle that had somehow survived 3 decades of mountain weather. Inside, Elias found a brass surveying instrument of obvious quality and complexity, along with a leather journal that belonged to someone identified only as Williams in the expedition records. Williams's journal contained technical observations about rock formations and mineral deposits, but it also included personal reflections that shed new light on what had happened to the survey team. According to his entries, the crew had become aware that they were being watched by unknown parties who seemed to have prior knowledge of their movements and discoveries. August 3rd, 1859. Elias read aloud as they rested by the creek. Found fresh horse tracks near our camp this morning. Shod horses, not Indian ponies. Someone has been observing our work for at least a week. McCrae believes we should abandon the survey and head for Denver. But the potential of this find is too great to abandon without proper documentation. August 15th, 1859. Confrontation at dawn. 3 men, well armed, claimed to represent Eastern mining interests with prior claims to this territory. Demanded we surrender all survey materials and leave immediately. McCrae refused, producing our official commission from the territorial government. They departed, but their leader, a man called Brennan, made it clear this was not finished. Martha looked up from her own examination of the surveying instrument, concern evident in her expression. This Brennan, do you think he might still be around? Or his people? Elias considered the question while studying the surrounding forest, wondering if they too might be under observation. Hard to say. But mining interests don't just disappear because their representatives get old. If there was money behind this in 1859, there's likely still money behind it today. They spent the afternoon exploring the area around the claim markers, and what they found exceeded even the optimistic assessments in the survey reports. Exposed rock formations showed clear evidence of mineral veins, and a small excavation site revealed traces of gold that glittered in the afternoon sunlight. Elias's father and his colleagues hadn't simply stumbled onto a promising location. They had discovered what could genuinely be called a fortune in precious metals. But their investigation also revealed evidence of more recent activity. Fresh tool marks on some of the rock faces suggested that someone had been conducting their own exploration within the past few years. Boot prints in the soft earth near the creek were too well preserved to be very old, and they found the remains of a campfire that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. We're not the only ones who know about this, Martha observed, kneeling beside the fire pit to examine the partially burned remnants of what appeared to be official documents. Someone else has been here recently, and they've been doing more than just looking around. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they decided to head back to Elias's cabin. But their return journey revealed one more unsettling discovery. Near the trail junction that led to town, they found clear evidence that their own movements had been observed. Fresh horse tracks paralleled their route for nearly a mile. always staying just out of sight among the trees, suggesting a rider who was both skilled and deliberate in remaining undetected. That evening, as they reviewed their discoveries by lamplight in Elias's cabin, the implications of what they'd learned settled over them like a gathering storm. The treasure was real, more extensive and valuable than the documents had suggested. But they were not alone in their knowledge, and whoever else knew about the claims had the resources and motivation to watch for anyone who might threaten their interests. "What's our next move?" Martha asked, spreading the maps across the table once again. Elias studied the pattern of claim markers they'd located, comparing their positions to the coordinate system his father had established. "We need to understand who else knows about this and what legal claims they might have. If my father's survey was legitimate, and if his death prevented him from properly filing the claims, then I might have inherited rights that are still valid under territorial law. And if the people who drove away your father's team have been working these claims illegally for 30 years, then we're dealing with more than just claim jumpers. We're dealing with people who've built their fortunes on stolen ground, and they won't give it up without a fight." Martha gathered the documents they'd been studying, her expression thoughtful. "I know a lawyer in Denver who specializes in mining law. Josiah Whitmore. He's helped settle disputes over old claims before. Maybe he could tell us where we stand legally. Can he be trusted?" "I've known him for 15 years. He's honest, and he's not afraid of powerful interests when he knows he's in the right." Outside the cabin windows, the mountain darkness seemed deeper than usual, as if the weight of their discoveries had somehow altered the very nature of the night itself. Somewhere in that darkness, Elias suspected, other eyes were watching, and other minds were planning responses to the questions he and Martha had begun asking. The quiet life he'd built in these mountains was ending, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. But as he looked at his father's carefully drawn maps and read again the words of love and hope in that final letter, Elias knew there could be no turning back. His father's legacy was waiting to be claimed, and whatever the cost, he intended to see that Thomas McCrae's sacrifices had not been in vain. The journey to Denver required 2 days of hard riding, and Elias spent every mile wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. Consulting a lawyer meant involving another person in their secret, and it meant leaving the security of familiar mountain territory for a city where unknown enemies might have eyes and ears everywhere. But Martha had convinced him that understanding their legal position was essential before they proceeded any further. Denver, in the autumn of 1889, was a city transforming itself from frontier settlement into something approaching civilization. Electric streetlights had begun replacing gas lamps in the business district, and the sound of construction filled the air as new buildings rose to accommodate the territory's growing population. But beneath the veneer of progress, it remained a place where fortunes were made and lost on the basis of claims both legal and dubious, and where men with enough money could buy whatever justice they required. Josiah Whitmore's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Larimer Street, its windows overlooking the bustling activity of Denver's commercial heart. When Martha led Elias up the narrow staircase and through the frosted glass door marked Whitmore and Associates, they found themselves in a space that spoke of both prosperity and scholarly attention to detail. Law books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and the desk was covered with carefully organized stacks of legal documents and territorial maps. Whitmore himself proved to be a man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense, intelligent eyes that suggested he missed very little of what went on around him. He greeted Martha with obvious warmth, but his expression grew serious when she introduced Elias and explained the general nature of their business. "Mining claims from the late 50s, Whitmore repeated, settling behind his desk and reaching for a thick legal volume. "That's a particularly complex area of law, especially when the original claimants are deceased and the claims were never properly registered. Before we proceed, gentlemen, I should warn you that this conversation is protected by attorney-client privilege, but that protection extends only so far as the law allows. If what you're asking me to evaluate involves anything illegal or potentially dangerous, I reserve the right to withdraw from representation." Elias appreciated the lawyer's directness. "What we're discussing is legal, Mr. Whitmore, but it may indeed be dangerous for reasons that have nothing to do with the law." Over the next hour, Elias and Martha presented their evidence to the attorney, watching his expression change from professional skepticism to genuine astonishment as the scope of their discovery became clear. Whitmore examined the survey documents with obvious expertise, occasionally referring to territorial statutes and mining regulations as he worked to understand the legal implications of what they'd found. "This is extraordinary work," he said finally, setting down the last of the journals. "Professional surveying of this quality would have cost a considerable sum to commission. The fact that these claims were never properly filed suggests that something prevented your father and his colleagues from completing the legal process. According to the journals, they were threatened by men representing Eastern mining interests who claimed prior rights to the territory." Whitmore nodded grimly. "I'm familiar with the tactics you're describing. In the 1850s and early 1860s, several large mining syndicates sent advance teams into promising territories to establish claims before legitimate prospectors could file their paperwork. Sometimes these operations were legal, but more often they relied on intimidation and violence to secure their positions." "What does that mean for our situation?" Martha asked. The lawyer consulted another volume, running his finger down columns of legal text before responding. "Under territorial law as it existed in 1859, your father's survey work would have established what we call possessory rights, a legal claim to the minerals based on discovery and documentation, even without formal filing. If he died before completing the registration process, those rights would have passed to his heirs." Elias felt his pulse quicken. "You're saying I might have legal claim to the minerals on my own land?" "Potentially, yes. But there are complications. If other parties have been working the claims in the intervening years, they might have established their own rights through what's called adverse possession, and if powerful interests are involved, they may have found ways to legitimize their claims through political influence or corrupted filing processes." Whitmore stood and walked to his window, looking down at the busy street below before continuing. "There's something else you should understand. Mining claims of this magnitude don't just disappear, even after 30 years. If the original survey was as valuable as these documents suggest, someone has been monitoring the situation, waiting for any sign that the claims might be challenged." "You think they know we're here?" Elias asked. "I think you should assume they know everything, where you've been, who you've talked to, and what you've discovered. Men with enough money and influence to suppress mining claims for 3 decades don't leave such things to chance." The lawyer returned to his desk and began making notes on a legal pad. "However, that doesn't mean you're without options. If we can establish your legal standing and document the evidence you've collected, we might be able to force a resolution through the territorial courts. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but it's possible." Martha leaned forward in her chair. "What would that involve?" "First, we'd need to file a formal claim based on your father's survey work and your inheritance rights. Second, we'd need to conduct a complete investigation of any subsequent claims or activities on the disputed territory. Third, we'd need to be prepared for significant legal resistance from whoever has been profiting from these claims for the past 30 years. "And the risks?" Elias asked. Whitmore's expression grew grave. "Beyond the obvious legal costs and time involved, you'd be challenging people who have demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Your father and his colleagues didn't simply disappear, Mr. McCrae. They were eliminated because they threatened someone's financial empire. Those same people, or their successors, are still out there. The weight of this assessment settled over them like a heavy blanket." Elias had hoped that consulting a lawyer might provide them with clear options and reduced risks. But Whitmore's analysis suggested that any legal challenge would only increase their exposure to danger. "What do you recommend?" he asked. The attorney was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Legally, you have strong grounds for pursuing your claim. Ethically, I'm obligated to help you understand and exercise your rights. Practically, I'd advise you to consider whether the potential rewards justify the certain risks. And if we decide to proceed, then we'll need to move quickly and carefully. I'll begin researching the current legal status of your father's claims while you gather additional evidence. But understand this, once we file the necessary paperwork, there'll be no hiding what you've discovered. Everyone with an interest in those claims will know exactly who you are and what you represent." As they left Whitmore's office and emerged onto the busy Denver street, Elias felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. The lawyer had confirmed what he'd hoped, that his father's work gave him legitimate claim to what might be one of the richest mineral deposits in the territory. But he'd also confirmed what he'd feared, that pursuing those claims would put both him and Martha in mortal danger. Walking through the crowded streets of Denver, surrounded by the noise and activity of a growing city, Elias found himself thinking about the quiet solitude of his mountain cabin and the simple life he'd built there. That life was already lost, he realized. The moment he'd opened the wagon and discovered his father's legacy, his quiet existence had ended. Now the only question was whether he'd honor Thomas McCrae's sacrifices by seeing his work completed, or whether he'd let fear drive him away, as it had driven away so many others. By the time they reached their hotel, Elias had made his choice. His father had died, trying to secure a future for his family. The least his son could do was see that effort through to its conclusion. Whatever the cost might be, the return journey from Denver took on an ominous quality that neither Elias nor Martha discussed directly, though both felt the weight of unseen eyes following their movements. They varied their route, made unexpected stops, and took care to observe the landscape behind them for signs of pursuit. The paranoia felt both necessary and exhausting, transforming what should have been familiar mountain trails into potential ambush sites. 2 days out from the city, as they made camp beside a creek that tumbled down from the high peaks, Martha finally voiced what they'd both been thinking. "We're being followed," she said, keeping her voice low as she tended the fire. "Same rider, maybe two, staying just out of sight, but matching our pace too closely to be coincidence." Elias nodded, checking the loads in his rifle before setting it within easy reach. "Noticed them yesterday afternoon. Professional work, they're keeping their distance, but they want us to know they're there. Warning us off? Could be. Or they might just be gathering information, seeing where we go and who we talk to." The night passed without incident, but both maintained watches, and neither slept deeply. When morning came, they broke camp quickly and continued toward home, following game trails that would be difficult for mounted pursuit to navigate without revealing themselves. It was Martha who spotted the smoke first, a thin column rising from the direction of Elias's mountain cabin, too straight and persistent to be from his carefully banked fireplace. They spurred their horses forward, fear lending urgency to their movement as they climbed the familiar trail toward what had been Elias's sanctuary for 30 years. The cabin still stood, but the barn had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Elias's equipment, his winter supplies, and 3 decades of accumulated possessions lay scattered across the clearing in deliberate chaos. Someone had taken time to search through everything systematically before setting fire to the wooden structure that had housed his horses and tools. But it was the message nailed to his front door that confirmed the true nature of the visit. Written in bold letters on what appeared to be expensive paper was a single line: "Some secrets are best left buried." "B. Brennan," Martha breathed, recognizing the initial from the journal entries they'd read. "The man who threatened your father's survey team." Elias examined the note more closely, noting the quality of the paper and the confident handwriting. "Brennan would be an old man by now, if he's still alive at all. This is someone else using his name, maybe his son or successor. Inside the cabin, the search had been thorough but not destructive. Drawers had been opened and examined, but nothing appeared to have been broken or stolen. The searchers had been looking for something specific, undoubtedly the survey documents and maps that were now safely hidden in Martha's saddlebags. "They know we found the wagon," Martha observed, running her finger along the dust patterns on Elias's desk, where papers had been moved and replaced. "They know we've been to Denver. They probably know we consulted Whitmore, which means they've got people watching the law offices. Maybe bribes in place to report on certain types of business." As they examined the extent of the intrusion, a more disturbing pattern became clear. The searchers had focused particular attention on areas where documents might be hidden. Loose floorboards had been pried up. The space behind the fireplace had been examined, and even the root cellar had been thoroughly explored. These weren't common thieves looking for valuables. They were professionals searching for specific evidence. "What's our next move?" Martha asked as they stood in the yard surveying the damage. Before Elias could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A single rider was climbing the trail toward the cabin, making no attempt at concealment or stealth. As the figure drew closer, they recognized Jake Harmon from the livery stable. His face grim with news he was reluctant to deliver. "Elias, Martha," he called out as he reined in his horse. "Glad to see you're both safe. Had some visitors in town yesterday asking questions about your business, and I figured you ought to know about it." "What kind of visitors?" Elias asked. "3 men, well-dressed, riding expensive horses. Said they represented mining interests from back east and were investigating reports of unauthorized survey work in the area. They knew about your wagon purchase, knew you'd been poking around in the mountains, and they seemed real interested in what you might have found." Martha and Elias exchanged glances. The speed with which their activities had become known to outside interests confirmed their worst suspicions about the reach and organization of their opposition. "They talked to anyone else?" Martha inquired. "Made the rounds of most of the business owners, asking about your habits, your associates, your financial situation. Paid particular attention to anyone who might have helped you or given you advice. Did they threaten anybody?" Jake shook his head, but his expression remained troubled. "Not directly, but they made it clear that continued association with your affairs might not be in folks' best interests. The kind of polite warning that carries more weight than shouting." The implications were clear and chilling. By consulting Whitmore and conducting their investigation, Elias and Martha had triggered responses from people with the resources to monitor legal offices, track movements across territorial distances, and intimidate entire communities. They were dealing with an organization rather than individuals, and that organization had been protecting its interests in the disputed mining claims for 3 decades. "There's something else," Jake continued, reaching into his saddlebags. "Found this on my desk this morning, along with $50 in gold coins." He handed them a sealed envelope that bore Elias's name in the same confident handwriting as the message on the cabin door. Inside was a brief note that managed to be both courteous and threatening. "Mr. McCrae, your father was a good man who made poor choices. You need not repeat his mistakes. We are prepared to purchase your property for twice its assessed value, allowing you to relocate anywhere in the territory with sufficient funds to live comfortably. This offer expires in 7 days. After that, we cannot guarantee your continued safety or that of your associates." The note was unsigned, but a small symbol at the bottom, a stylized mountain peak with a railroad track running through it, suggested corporate backing rather than individual action. "Railroad money," Martha said, recognizing the symbol. "They're not just protecting mining claims, they're protecting future rail routes through mineral-rich territory." Elias studied the note, considering the implications of the 7-day ultimatum. The offer was generous enough to be tempting, providing him with the financial security to start over somewhere far from the complications of his father's legacy. But accepting it would mean abandoning not just his home, but his family's rightful inheritance and the memory of a father who had died protecting those very claims. "What are you thinking?" Martha asked, though her expression suggested she already knew his answer. "I'm thinking that threats and bribes are the tools of people who know they're in the wrong. If their claims were legitimate, they wouldn't need to intimidate folks or burn down barns. They'd just file their paperwork and let the courts decide. So we fight. We fight. But we do it smart, and we do it with help. Time to stop reacting to their moves and start making some of our own." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing where his barn had stood, Elias began planning not just resistance, but counterattack. His opponents had revealed themselves and their methods. Now it was time to discover exactly who they were and what vulnerabilities they might have left exposed in their confidence and their greed. The revelation came 3 days later, delivered by an unexpected messenger who rode up to Martha's store just after dawn. The young man wore the dust of hard travel and the urgency of someone carrying news that couldn't wait for proper business hours. In his saddlebags was a package from Josiah Whitmore that would change everything they thought they understood about their situation. Martha found Elias at the ruins of his barn, salvaging what tools had survived the fire and planning the reconstruction that would signal his refusal to be intimidated. When she arrived with Whitmore's package, her expression carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension that immediately captured his attention. "Legal documents," she said, handing him the thick envelope. "Whitmore says he found something in the territorial archives that we need to see immediately." Inside were photocopies of mining claims filed in Denver during the summer of 1859, along with a detailed letter from the attorney explaining their significance. As Elias read through the material, a picture emerged that contradicted everything they had assumed about the forces working against them. According to these records, Whitmore had written, "The claims your father's survey team documented were indeed filed legally and properly in June 1859. The paperwork was submitted by Thomas McCrae himself, acting as the designated representative of the survey company. The claims were approved, recorded, and have remained legally valid for the past 30 years. Elias looked up from the documents, his mind struggling to process the implications. If the claims were properly filed, then what happened to my father and his team? Martha was studying the claim certificates themselves, noting the official seals and territorial signatures that confirmed their authenticity. "There's more," she said, pointing to an additional document in the package. "Look at this." The paper was a transfer of ownership form, dated August 1859, showing that Thomas McCrae had legally transferred his mining claims to a company called Mountain Peak Development Corporation. The transfer had been witnessed and notarized, bearing Thomas McCrae's signature and the corporate seal of the purchasing company. "He sold them," Elias said quietly. "My father sold the claims before he disappeared." But as they examined the transfer document more carefully, disturbing details began to emerge. The price listed for the claims, valuable enough to fund railroad construction through mineral-rich territory, was listed as $1. The witnesses to the transaction included 2 names that appeared in the survey journals as members of the team that had threatened the expedition. This wasn't a sale, Martha realized. This was coercion. They forced him to sign over the claims for practically nothing, then made sure he couldn't challenge the transfer. Whitmore's letter confirmed their suspicions. Further research reveals that Mountain Peak Development Corporation was a shell company created specifically to hold these mining claims. The corporation's officers included several individuals with known connections to railroad interests and territorial political machinery. Your father appears to have been forced to sign over his rights under duress, after which he disappeared from all public records. The true scope of the conspiracy began to crystallize as they read through the supporting documentation Whitmore had uncovered. Mountain Peak Development Corporation had used the fraudulently obtained claims as collateral for massive loans from eastern banks, financing not just mining operations, but the construction of railroad spurs that would make the mineral extraction profitable. Over 30 years, Those initial claims had generated millions of dollars in wealth for people who had stolen them through intimidation and violence. But here's the crucial point. Whitmore's letter continued. Under territorial law, transfers obtained through fraud or duress are legally void. If we can prove that your father was coerced into signing over his claims, the original ownership would revert to his heirs, namely you. The implications were staggering. Elias wouldn't just be claiming ownership of undeveloped mining claims. He would be challenging the legal foundation of an entire business empire built on those claims over 3 decades. Every mine that had been developed, every railroad spur that had been constructed, every ton of ore that had been extracted, all of it would be subject to his legitimate ownership claim. No wonder they're willing to kill to protect their secret, he murmured. We're not just threatening their future profits, we're threatening to expose 30 years of theft and fraud. Martha was studying a map that showed the current extent of Mountain Peak Development Corporation's operations. The company now controlled mineral rights across thousands of acres, operated 3 active mines, and had partnerships with 2 major railroad companies. The wealth generated from Thomas McCrae's stolen claims had been used to build a business empire that stretched across multiple territories. There's something else, she said, pointing to a section of Whitmore's letter they hadn't yet read. He found out who's been running Mountain Peak Development Corporation all these years. The name at the bottom of the corporate documents was one that appeared throughout the correspondence. Harrison Brennan, Jr., son of the man who had originally threatened the survey team. The elder Brennan had died in 1874, but his son had inherited control of the corporation and had apparently continued his father's methods of protecting their illegally obtained assets. Brennan, Elias said, remembering the initials signed to the threatening message nailed to his door. Same family, next generation. But it was the final document in Whitmore's package that provided the most shocking revelation of all. Tucked between the legal papers was a copy of a newspaper clipping from the Denver Herald. Dated September 1859, the headline read, "Surveyor's body found in Mountain Creek. Foul play suspected." The article described the discovery of Thomas McCrae's body in a creek 20 miles from where the survey team had been working. The territorial marshal had ruled the death suspicious, noting evidence of violence, but no arrests had ever been made. The investigation had been closed after pressure from what the newspaper described as influential territorial interests. "They killed him," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After they forced him to sign over the claims, they murdered him to make sure he couldn't challenge the transfer." The weight of this revelation settled over both of them like a physical presence. Thomas McCrae hadn't simply disappeared or died in an accident. He had been murdered by the same people who were now threatening his son. The violence that had begun 30 years ago was still continuing, carried forward by a new generation of criminals protecting their inherited empire. Martha reached across and touched Elias's arm, offering what comfort she could. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you hoped to find when you started searching for answers about your father." "Actually, it is," he replied, his voice gaining strength as the initial shock gave way to something harder and more determined. "For 30 years, I've wondered why he never came home, whether he abandoned us or just got caught up in dreams that were bigger than his love for his family. Now I know the truth. He died trying to protect what was ours." The documents also explained the sophisticated surveillance and rapid response they'd encountered. Mountain Peak Development Corporation wasn't just a mining company. It was a criminal organization with the resources to monitor legal offices, track individuals across territorial distances, and coordinate intimidation campaigns. They'd had 30 years to develop their intelligence networks and establish their influence with local authorities. "What does this mean for our legal case?" Martha asked. Elias studied the claim certificates and transfer documents, seeing them now not as abstract legal papers, but as evidence of his father's murder and the theft of his family's inheritance. "It means we're not just filing a mining claim. We're exposing a conspiracy that goes back 3 decades and involves some of the most powerful people in the territory. And that makes us witnesses to murder, threats to a business empire, people who need to disappear before we can testify in court. The 7-day ultimatum took on new significance in light of what they'd learned. Harrison Brennan Jr. wasn't offering to buy Elias's property out of generosity. He was trying to eliminate the last obstacle to legitimizing his family's criminal empire. Once Elias was gone, either bought off or killed, there would be no one left to challenge the fraudulent transfer that had started it all. But knowledge, Elias realized, was a weapon that could cut both ways. If Mountain Peak Development Corporation was vulnerable to exposure of their criminal origins, then perhaps it was time to stop defending and start attacking. His father had died protecting these claims, but his son was still alive to see justice done. The question now was whether they could survive long enough to present their evidence in court, and whether the territorial legal system had enough integrity left to challenge an organization with 30 years of wealth and influence behind it. Looking at the evidence spread across Martha's store counter, Elias felt the weight of his father's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. He'd been preparing his whole life to wear. The plan they devised was born of desperation and shaped by the understanding that their window of opportunity was closing fast. With 5 days remaining on Brennan's ultimatum, Elias and Martha knew that their only chance lay in forcing a confrontation before their enemies could eliminate them quietly in the mountains. Whitmore's final telegram had been both encouraging and terrifying. Territorial governor agrees to emergency hearing if evidence presented within 72 hours. Warning: sources report Mountain Peak mobilizing private security. Exercise extreme caution. The territorial capital lay 2 hard days' ride from their position through country that would offer numerous opportunities for ambush. But Martha had proposed a strategy that might give them the advantage of surprise. Instead of traveling together as expected, they would split up, each carrying duplicate copies of the essential documents while taking different routes to the capital. They'll be watching the main roads, she reasoned as they made their preparations in the back room of her store. But they can't cover every trail and game path between here and the capital. Elias spread his maps across her table, marking the route he intended to take through high mountain passes that would be treacherous but unlikely to be monitored. You stick to the valley roads. Travel in daylight, stay visible, make them think we're traveling together. I'll come in from the north through country that most folks wouldn't attempt on horseback. And if one of us doesn't make it, then the one who does tells the whole story and sees that justice gets done. The weight of that commitment settled between them like an oath sworn before witnesses. Neither spoke of their fear, but both understood that they were likely riding toward their deaths. Mountain Peak Development Corporation had killed to protect their secret once. They wouldn't hesitate to do it again. As they prepared to part ways, Martha produced an item that she'd been saving for this moment, a small metal cylinder that she'd discovered hidden in the false bottom of an old trunk in her store's storage room. Found this years ago and never could figure out what it was, she said, handing it to Elias. But after reading your father's journals, I think it might be important. The cylinder was made of brass and sealed with wax, obviously designed to protect whatever was inside from moisture and damage. When Elias carefully broke the seal and extracted the contents, he found himself holding a detailed map of the mountain region, drawn in his father's unmistakable handwriting. But this map was different from the others they'd found in the wagon. Instead of showing mineral deposits and survey markers, it documented something else entirely, a network of caves and underground passages that connected various points throughout the mountain region. Notes in the margins indicated that Thomas McCrae had discovered these natural formations during his survey work and recognized their potential as hiding places or emergency escape routes. He knew they were coming for him, Elias realized, studying the careful notations his father had made about water sources, defensible positions, and storage sites within the cave system. He was planning for the possibility that he might need to disappear. 1. Location on the map was marked with special significance, a large chamber deep within the mountain that Thomas had labeled Final Cache. According to his notes, this chamber contained backup copies of all survey documents, additional mineral samples, and what he described as evidence of criminal conspiracy. He hid proof, Martha breathed, understanding the implications immediately. Your father knew about the threats and the illegal pressure, and he documented everything before they could silence him. The location of the final cache was approximately 12 miles from Elias's cabin, accessible through a series of connected caves that would require technical climbing equipment and considerable nerve to navigate. But if Thomas McCrae's final evidence still existed after 30 years, it might provide the additional proof they needed to ensure their case was ironclad. Change of plans, Elias said, already calculating the time required to reach the cache and return. I need to reach that chamber before we go to the territorial capital. That's 2 more days we don't have. Brennan's deadline doesn't matter if we can prove everything. With my father's hidden evidence added to what we already have, there won't be any question about the truth of our claims. Martha studied the map, noting the complexity of the cave system and the dangers inherent in underground exploration. You can't go alone. If something happens to you in those caves, the evidence dies with you, and I can't risk you. If Mountain Peak's men are watching, they're already watching. The question is whether we let fear make our decisions for us or whether we do what needs to be done. In the end, they reached a compromise born of mutual stubbornness and shared recognition of what was at stake. Martha would begin her journey to the territorial capital as planned, carrying the legal documents and establishing their presence in the government offices. Elias would attempt to reach his father's final cache and retrieve whatever evidence remained there, then follow as quickly as possible. If I'm not at the capital within 3 days, he told her, present what we have and don't wait for me, and if you are there, then we'll have enough evidence to bury Harrison Brennan and his whole criminal empire. The cave entrance, marked on Thomas McCrae's map, was hidden behind a waterfall in a canyon that Elias had explored countless times during his years in the mountains, without ever suspecting its significance. The sound of falling water masked any noise he might make, while the constant spray created a natural barrier that would discourage casual exploration. Equipped with ropes, lanterns, and climbing gear, Elias squeezed through the narrow opening behind the waterfall and found himself in a natural corridor that extended deep into the mountain. His father's map proved accurate in every detail, showing passages, elevation changes, and potential hazards with the precision of professional surveying. The journey through the cave system took longer than expected, requiring careful navigation through chambers filled with treacherous loose rock and passages barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. But Thomas McCrae's notes proved invaluable, guiding Elias around the most dangerous areas and toward the chamber that had been designated as the final cache. When he finally reached the hidden chamber, 3 hours after entering the cave system, Elias found himself in a natural cathedral carved from living rock by millennia of underground water flow. In the center of the chamber, protected by careful stacking of stones and wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth, was a collection of materials that represented Thomas McCrae's final attempt to ensure the truth would survive, even if he did not. The documents inside the cache included detailed correspondence between Harrison Brennan Sr. and various territorial officials, revealing a network of corruption that extended far beyond simple mining claim disputes. There were records of bribes paid, judges influenced, and law enforcement officers instructed to ignore evidence of criminal activity. But the most damaging evidence was a signed confession from one of Brennan's associates, apparently written as insurance against betrayal by his criminal partners. The confession detailed the plan to eliminate the survey team, the methods used, to force Thomas McCrae's signature on the fraudulent transfer documents and the decision to murder him when he proved unwilling to remain silent about the conspiracy. "We couldn't let him live," the confession read. "He knew too much and had too much integrity to be bought off like the others. Brennan said it would send a message to anyone else who might think about challenging our operations." As Elias read, through his father's final evidence by lantern light in the hidden chamber, he felt the weight of 30 years of injustice settling into resolve. Thomas McCrae had died trying to protect not just his family's inheritance, but the rule of law itself against criminal corruption. His son had inherited more than mining claims. He had inherited an obligation to see that justice was finally done. The return journey through the cave system seemed shorter, driven by urgency and the knowledge that time was running out. When Elias finally emerged behind the waterfall, the sun was setting over the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed appropriate for what was to come. He rode through the night toward the territorial capital, his saddlebags heavy with evidence that would either expose one of the territory's most powerful criminal organizations or get him killed in the attempt. Behind him, the mountains that had been his home for 30 years receded into darkness, while ahead lay a confrontation that would determine whether his father's sacrifices had been in vain. The territorial capital grew larger on the horizon as dawn broke over the eastern plains, its government buildings representing the last hope for legal justice in a conflict that had already claimed too many lives. Somewhere in that city, Martha was preparing to present their case, while Harrison Brennan's people were undoubtedly working to ensure that case would never be heard. By the time the sun was fully risen, Elias McCrae was ready to finish what his father had started 30 years ago, armed with evidence that would either vindicate Thomas McCrae's memory or join it in death at the hands of the same criminal organization that had destroyed the original survey team. The territorial capital of Denver had transformed overnight into a battlefield disguised as a city conducting normal business. As Elias rode through the early morning streets toward the government buildings, he could sense the tension that preceded. Violent confrontation. Too many well-dressed strangers loitering near official buildings, too many eyes tracking his movement, too many hands resting near concealed weapons. Martha was waiting for him at the steps of the territorial courthouse, her face pale but determined. Beside her stood Josiah Whitmore, whose normally calm demeanor showed signs of strain that suggested the past few days had been anything but routine legal preparation. "Thank God you made it," Martha said as Elias dismounted and secured his horse. "We weren't sure. There have been incidents, people asking questions, making threats, trying to find out where you'd gone." Whitmore stepped forward, his expression grave. "Mr. McCrae, I need to inform you that our hearing this morning may be our only opportunity to present this case. There are forces working to have the matter dismissed before we can enter evidence." "What kind of forces?" "The kind that come with significant financial resources and political influence. Mountain Peak Development Corporation has retained 3 of the territory's most expensive law firms and filed multiple motions to prevent us from presenting evidence they claim was obtained illegally." Elias patted his saddlebags, feeling the weight of his father's hidden documents. "Then it's a good thing we have evidence they don't know about." Inside the courthouse, the hearing room was packed with observers whose presence felt more like a gathering storm than routine legal proceedings. On one side sat the representatives of Mountain Peak Development Corporation, expensive lawyers in eastern suits flanked by men whose profession was clearly something other than legal advocacy. On the other side, Elias, Martha, and Whitmore faced what appeared to be overwhelming opposition, but it was the man seated at the center of the corporate delegation who captured Elias's attention. Harrison Brennan Jr. was younger than expected, perhaps 45, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from a lifetime of having money solve problems before they became serious. When their eyes met across the crowded room, Brennan's expression showed no surprise, only the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to measuring threats and determining appropriate responses. Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford entered the hearing room precisely at 9 o'clock, his presence commanding immediate silence from the assembled crowd. Crawford had built his political career on a reputation for fairness and integrity, but the tension in his bearing suggested he understood the significance of what was about to unfold. "This emergency hearing," Crawford announced, taking his seat, behind the judge's bench, has been called to address claims regarding mining rights that may affect significant territorial interests. Mr. Whitmore, you have requested this hearing. Present your case. The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed battle between competing versions of truth. Whitmore presented the evidence they had gathered with methodical precision: the original survey documents, the legal claim certificates, the fraudulent transfer papers, and the evidence of coercion and murder that had been hidden for 30 years. But Mountain Peak's legal team countered every revelation with procedural objections, challenges to the authenticity of documents, and arguments about statute of limitations that seemed designed to delay rather than refute the evidence being presented. "Your Honor," the lead corporate attorney argued, "these allegations concern events that allegedly occurred 3 decades ago. The evidence has been compromised by age and questionable chain of custody. More importantly, Mountain Peak Development Corporation has operated in good faith for 30 years based on legally recorded transfers that have never been challenged." It was then that Elias stood and addressed the governor directly. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence that directly addresses these objections." The courtroom fell silent as Elias approached the bench and presented the materials from his father's final cache. Governor Crawford examined the documents with obvious surprise, particularly the signed confession that detailed the conspiracy to eliminate the survey team. "These materials," Elias explained, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "were hidden by my father before his murder. They include contemporary records of the criminal conspiracy, correspondence between the perpetrators, and a detailed confession from one of Harrison Brennan Sr.'s associates." The reaction from the Mountain Peak delegation was immediate and telling. Brennan leaned forward to whisper urgently to his attorneys, while several of the men, who were clearly not lawyers, began moving toward the exits. "Furthermore," Elias continued, "these documents prove that Mountain Peak Development Corporation was established specifically to legitimize the theft of legally filed mining claims, and that the murder of Thomas McCrae was a calculated decision to prevent legal challenges to that theft." Governor Crawford studied the confession document, his expression growing darker as he read the details of the conspiracy. When he looked up, his gaze fixed on Harrison Brennan with unmistakable judgment. "Mr. Brennan," Crawford said, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law, "these are serious accusations supported by what appears to be contemporary evidence. How does your corporation respond to allegations that it was founded on criminal conspiracy and murder?" The moment of confrontation had arrived. 30 years of hidden truth were about to collide with 30 years of criminal success, and the next few minutes would determine whether justice or money would prove stronger in the territorial courts. Harrison Brennan rose from his seat with the measured calm of a man accustomed to controlling situations through wealth and intimidation. But as he faced Governor Crawford and the damning evidence spread across the judicial bench, something in his demeanor suggested that control was slipping away. "Your Honor," Brennan began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who had talked his way out of difficult situations before, "these allegations are based on documents of questionable authenticity presented by a man who has obvious financial motivation to fabricate evidence. Mountain Peak Development Corporation has operated legally and openly for 3 decades, contributing significantly to territorial development and economic growth. Governor Crawford held up the confession document that Elias had retrieved from the final cache. This confession details the murder of Thomas McCrae and describes your father's direct involvement in forcing fraudulent property transfers. It's signed, witnessed, and dated 1859. How do you explain its existence? For the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty flickered across Brennan's features. That document could have been fabricated by anyone with access to historical records and old paper. There's no way to verify. Actually, there is, interrupted Whitmore, stepping forward with an additional folder. I've had the paper and ink analyzed by territorial forensic experts. The materials are consistent with those used in 1859, and the handwriting matches other confirmed samples from the signatory. The corporate legal team exchanged alarmed glances as their carefully prepared defense strategy began to crumble. But it was the behavior of Brennan's non-legal associates that provided the most telling response to the evidence being presented. 3 men, who had been seated behind the corporate delegation, were now moving purposefully toward the courtroom exits, their hands reaching beneath their coats for weapons that courthouse security had somehow failed to detect. "Nobody leaves," Governor Crawford commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Bailiffs, secure those men immediately." What happened next transformed the legal hearing into something approaching warfare. The escaping men drew pistols and began firing toward the judicial bench, apparently intending to eliminate both the evidence and the witnesses in a desperate attempt to protect their criminal enterprise. Elias threw himself toward Martha, pulling her behind the heavy wooden barrier that separated the public gallery from the court proceedings. Around them, territorial bailiffs and courthouse security engaged Brennan's gunmen in a firefight that filled the formal hearing room with smoke and the thunder of gunfire. Through the chaos, Elias saw Governor Crawford calmly gathering the critical documents from his bench, apparently determined to preserve the evidence even at personal risk. Whitmore had taken cover behind an overturned table, still clutching additional legal papers that represented months of careful preparation. But it was Harrison Brennan's reaction that proved most revealing. Instead of seeking cover or calling for help, he stood in the center of the gunfight with the expression of someone watching 30 years of careful construction collapsing around him. "Stop this!" he shouted over the gunfire. "Stand down! All of you, stand down!" His authority over the gunman was absolute. At his command, the shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the courtroom filled with gun smoke and the groans of wounded men. But the damage to his position was irreversible. By revealing his command over armed enforcers who had attempted to commit murder in a territorial courthouse, Brennan had confirmed everything the hidden documents alleged about his organization's willingness to use violence to protect their criminal enterprise. Governor Crawford emerged from behind his bench, his judicial robes torn, but his authority intact. "Mr. Brennan, you have just demonstrated in front of multiple witnesses that your organization maintains armed criminals prepared to commit murder to suppress evidence against your corporation. This confirms the allegations made in these historical documents." "Your Honor," Brennan said, his composure finally cracking, "you don't understand the complexity of the situation. Mountain Peak Development Corporation has invested millions of dollars in territorial development based on legally recorded claims. If you invalidate those claims, you'll destroy legitimate businesses and eliminate hundreds of jobs." "Legitimate businesses," Crawford replied with cold precision, "are not built on murder and fraud. Legal claims are not established through coercion and violence." Elias stood slowly, helping Martha to her feet while keeping his attention focused on Brennan. The moment of final confrontation had arrived, not the dramatic physical battle he might have expected, but something more profound. The collision between criminal wealth and legal justice in front of witnesses who would carry the truth forward regardless of what happened next. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice steady despite the violence that had just erupted around them. "I'm not here to destroy legitimate business or eliminate jobs. I'm here to reclaim what was stolen from my family and to see that the men who murdered my father finally face justice for their crimes." Governor Crawford nodded, his decision already forming. "Based on the evidence presented today and confirmed by the actions we have all witnessed, I find sufficient grounds to invalidate the 1859 transfer of mining claims from Thomas McCrae to Mountain Peak Development Corporation. Furthermore, I order the immediate arrest of Harrison Brennan, Jr. on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The weight of 30 years of hidden truth had finally overcome 30 years of criminal success. Justice had prevailed, but the cost had been measured in blood, violence, and the destruction of illusions about how power operated in the territorial system. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation that brought down Mountain Peak Development Corporation, Elias McCrae stood on the front porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching the sun rise over mountains that had finally revealed their secrets. The barn had been reconstructed using lumber from his own land, and smoke rose peacefully from the chimney of a home that no longer carried the weight of hidden threats and family mysteries. The legal aftermath had been complex but conclusive. Governor Crawford's ruling had triggered a territorial investigation that uncovered decades of corruption, bribery, and intimidation, orchestrating by the Brennan family and their associates. Harrison Brennan, Jr. was serving a 20-year prison sentence, while his criminal organization had been dismantled and its assets seized to compensate victims of their fraudulent activities. More importantly for Elias, the restoration of his father's legitimate mining claims had been validated by every level of territorial law. The mineral rights that Thomas McCrae had died protecting now belonged to his son, along with compensation for 30 years of stolen revenues that amounted to a fortune beyond anything Elias had ever imagined possible. But wealth, he had discovered, brought its own complications. The simple life he had built in these mountains was no longer possible when his property contained some of the richest mineral deposits in the territory. Mining companies, investors, and business partners arrived weekly with proposals and contracts designed to extract maximum profit from the land that had been his sanctuary. Martha Henderson had proven invaluable in navigating these new challenges. Her practical business sense and understanding of legal matters had helped Elias structure mining partnerships that would develop his property responsibly while preserving the natural beauty that had drawn him to these mountains in the first place. More than that, her steady presence had provided continuity during months of testimony, legal proceedings, and the overwhelming attention that came with exposing territorial corruption. "Thinking about your father?" she asked, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the morning mail that included correspondence from mining engineers, environmental consultants, and territorial officials still working to unravel the full extent of the Mountain Peak conspiracy. "Every morning," Elias replied, accepting the coffee gratefully, wondering what he'd think about how things turned out, whether he'd approve of the choices I've made. The mining operation they had established was unlike anything the territory had seen before. Instead of the destructive extraction methods typically employed by large corporations, Elias had insisted on techniques that would minimize environmental damage while providing fair wages and safe working conditions for local miners. The profits were substantial, but they were being used to fund territorial schools, medical facilities, and infrastructure improvements that would benefit entire communities rather than distant investors. "I think he'd be proud," Martha said, settling into the chair beside his. "You didn't just reclaim what was stolen. You're using it to build something better than what existed before." Among the morning mail was a letter from Josiah Whitmore, who had become not just their attorney, but a trusted friend during the months of legal proceedings. His correspondence brought news of continuing investigations into other potentially fraudulent mining claims throughout the territory, inspired by the evidence that Elias had brought forward. 23 additional cases, Elias read aloud from Whitmore's letter. Families whose legitimate claims were suppressed through intimidation or fraud. People who were driven away or killed to protect illegal operations. The territorial government is reopening investigations that were buried for decades. The scope of the corruption that had been exposed was staggering. The Brennan organization had been just one part of a larger network of criminal enterprises that had controlled mining, transportation, and political influence throughout the region. But the evidence from Thomas McCrae's final cache had provided the key that unlocked investigations into crimes that many had assumed were lost to history. As the morning progressed, visitors began arriving for what had become a weekly tradition. Families of other survey team members killed in 1859 came to share stories and seek closure that had been denied them for 3 decades. Children and grandchildren of Thomas McCrae's colleagues gathered to honor the memory of men who had died, protecting their professional integrity against criminal corruption. Among the visitors was an elderly woman who introduced herself as Sarah McCrae Thornton, Thomas McCrae's daughter from a brief first marriage that had ended when her mother died in a cholera epidemic. She was Elias's half-sister, a connection to family he had never known existed until the legal proceedings brought forgotten relatives forward to share their memories. "He used to tell me stories about the mountains," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of 70 years and the joy of finally learning what had happened to the father she'd lost as a child. Said someday he'd show me country so beautiful. It would make me understand why God had made the world so big. These family connections had been perhaps the most unexpected result of exposing the truth about his father's death. Thomas McCrae's memory had brought together people who shared his blood but had been scattered by circumstances, creating a family network that Elias was still learning to navigate. As afternoon faded toward evening and the visitors departed for their own homes, Elias found himself alone with Martha on the porch where this story had truly begun 6 months earlier when he'd examined a rusted wagon by lantern light. "Any regrets?" she asked, watching the last of the mining company representatives disappear down the mountain trail. Elias considered the question seriously. His life had been transformed beyond recognition, from solitary mountain man to the center of territorial legal proceedings, from subsistence hunter to wealthy mining magnate, from a man without family to someone connected to relatives he was still meeting. "Only one," he said finally. "That my father didn't live to see his work completed." But even that regret carried the satisfaction of knowing that Thomas McCrae's sacrifices had not been in vain. The claims he had died protecting were now generating wealth that would benefit generations, while his murderers had finally faced justice for crimes that many had believed were buried too deeply in the past to ever be resolved. The mountains that had kept their secrets for 30 years now revealed them freely, transformed from a place of mystery into a place of resolution where the past and future had finally found peace with each other as stars appeared over the familiar peaks and the sounds of night settled over the valley. Elias McCrae felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had honored his father's memory while building something worthy of the legacy that had been passed down to him.